Scotland, home of haggis, men in fancy skirts, and whiskey. It is a place that many Americans may call home or harken back to in their ancestry. However, unlike what many may think, Scotland is not its own country and is instead part of a union between England, Northern Ireland, and Wales. This video is specifically examining both this union alongside Scotland's attempts to leave it and policy proposals for what the United States government should pursue concerning Scottish independence, or Indyref as it is colloquially known. First to understand this is that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union. This means that in theory, all nations that are part of the UK joined it willingly and not through the use of force. But a natural result of this is that if one nation no longer wishes to be part of the UK, they should be allowed to leave. The feelings for Scottish independence have existed ever since the Act of Union in 1707, which joined Scotland and England together as one nation. These ideas eventually hit a boiling point in 2014, where after several decades of campaigning, Scotland was allowed to hold its own independence referendum, known as Indyref. Should the Scottish people have voted for a majority to leave the UK and become their own nation, they would be allowed to. The arguments for why this would be a good idea were relatively simple. Scotland is about 5% of the UK population and as such does not have that much representation in the primary government of the UK, known as Westminster. And so therefore, if Scotland was to leave, they would have greater control over their own politics. This was becoming more and more of an issue as the voting patterns of Scottish voters consistently shifted to the left wing, whilst English voters were notably more conservative and tended to vote in the Conservative Party, while Scotland tended to vote in either Labour or the Scottish National Party. Furthermore, many in Scotland felt that the money earned by its natural resources weren't being used to support Scotland and instead were being sent to the rest of the UK to support them. The primary ones that come up in these discussions are the North Sea oil reserves, which possess around 3.3 billion barrels of crude oil. But Scotland also possesses other natural resources such as wood, coal, iron, and copper. However, Scotland already had substantial amounts of control over its own affairs, with the Scottish Parliament being implemented 15 years beforehand, which allowed for broad governance to be held by Scots in their own nation. The power of the Scottish government is similar to that of a state legislature, with the only exception being taxes, which were reserved for the Westminster government in London. At the time, and still now, it was under the control of the Scottish National Party, the primary independence party of Scotland, which had been making clear the opposition to the policies of Westminster, which, at the time, had been focused on austerity measures, which continued to be exceptionally unpopular in Scotland. Such a political party made the argument that if they left, the cuts would be stopped, people's lives made better. However, as evidenced by the lack of a Scottish flag on many maps, you'll notice that this failed. Once all the votes were tallied, a total of 44.7% of the population voted yes for independence, while 55.3% voted no. This was a fairly determinative result, but it was by no means a settled matter. As mentioned before, the SNP has stayed in power since, still acting as the primary independence party of Scotland, and with the assistance of smaller parties, such as the Scottish Greens, they have continued to maintain a majority in the Scottish Parliament. They've continued to pursue a second referendum, although there have been substantial changes in leadership since. In 2022, Nicola Sturgeon, the long-time and very popular leader of the SNP, stepped down and was later accused of embezzling party funds for her own enrichment. As of now, almost 3 years after the initial investigations, no legal proceedings have been brought to her by the government and all charges have been dropped. However, her husband, Peter Murrell, is still under investigation. Despite the substantial change in leadership, the two subsequent leaders since, Humza Yousaf and John Sweeney, have not made any major shifts in their attitudes towards Scottish independence nor internal politics. The SNP's position on policies, especially those of military matters, are of substantial interest to the United States. Due to Scotland bordering the North Sea, it has historically served as part of a network of submarine bases to provide first and second strike capabilities against the USSR and modern Russian Republic, without which would serve a substantial hole in US submarine operations. Current SNP policy, however, states that nuclear weapons and foreign military bases should be removed in an independent Scottish state. Furthermore, the North Sea oil fields serve a vital role in US foreign policy. As well as there is no direct United States investment into these fields, its production of oil and gas provides a source of reliable production, disconnected from OPEC and unfavorable regimes in other parts of the world, thereby leading to reduced oil prices for American consumers alongside American military operations. Finally, there is the substantial influence from Scottish culture into American spheres. This is partially caused by familial ties shared by many Americans with Scotland due to immigration history, causing many to see Scottishness as part of their own cultural identity. As a result, many Americans travel to Scotland on a regular basis and have an invested interest in its politics. Should the current administration wish to appeal to that demographic of American, then some care should be given to this issue. Briefing of possible outcomes. To start with, the most unlikely option would be violent protests or revolution. With the success of anti-government forces in Syria being only a few months ago, it is very tempting to ask if there is a possibility for a similar occurrence to happen in Scotland. However, that is unlikely to the point of absurdity. While Scotland is by no means an especially wealthy country, being only 8% of the UK's GDP, it is not suffering from any major economic or social hardships. For many, Indyref occurring is not a choice between life and death, like in many revolutions, nor is the UK government conducting widespread crackdowns on dissidents. It is still a modern liberal democracy, and all major independence parties have made it clear that they will not conduct an independence referendum outside of legal channels, making it unlikely that a full violent revolution will occur. The only modern Scottish political force which campaigned for Scottish independence through violence was the Scottish Republican Socialist Movement, or SRSM, although it was heavily marginalised by all other independence movements, and as of now has been shut down with no members in the Scottish Parliament or really any serious support among the population. In total, this outcome is highly unlikely to occur in a decade, much less in the next 18 to 24 months. The second potential scenario is that an independence vote occurs. This is exceptionally unlikely. In 2022, the Scottish government attempted to hold its own independence referendum, claiming that it had the power to call for such a referendum and to make it legally binding. However, after a court battle between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government, it was ultimately ruled against the Scottish Government, with the SNP being unable to call for an independence referendum unless Westminster gives approval of it. Given that any referendum would only require a 5% boost in its popularity to be successful, it is unlikely that any future government, whether it be Conservative, Labour, or a combination of them, is going to allow one to occur. There are, however, two possible reasons it could occur. Either there is a substantial and intense change in the non-Scottish British population's attitude towards Indyref, which could allow for it to be advantageous for the sitting government to allow, or a hung parliament that allows for the SNP to become kingmaker. The latter would necessitate the UK Parliament to be split evenly between all the major parties and require the current 9 SNP MPs to form a government with one party or another, or to assist in passing an important bill. Theoretically, the SNP MPs could make the support contingent upon the allowance of a second Indyref vote, to which one party or the other would need to support. This is clearly very unlikely, as it requires a very specific political sphere that will not exist for at least 3 years as of the recording of this video. The current ruling government in Labour has a supermajority in Parliament, having 406 of the 650 total seats, and there will not be another election until at least 2028. As it should be made clear, in the next 18 to 24 months, there will be very little change in the status of Scottish independence. The final scenario I want to present is the only one I have high confidence in, and that is a continuation of the status quo. The current leader of the SNP, John Swinney, has made no moves to change the existing policy of peaceful independence. Scottish attitudes on Indyref have also stayed very consistent, hovering around 44 to 47% approval since the 2014 vote, indicating that in the past 11 years, despite a concentrated effort by both sides to convince the other of their outlook, there has been very little movement in any direction. With this in mind, it is possible that everyone who could be convinced to one side or the other has already been convinced, and their opinions will not change regardless of the amount of time passed or changes in existing policy. With the next Scottish election in May of 2026 and the SNP continuing to maintain its dominance in the polls, it seems that the current status quo is unlikely to change. The SNP does, however, have a projected substantial gain in the Westminster election, winning 44 of the 46 Scottish seats. However, that election is scheduled for 2029, and that means for the next 48 months, the SNP will continue to dominate Scottish politics, but be unable to achieve the ultimate goal of independence. The predictions I've just outlined have some issues in their approaches, however. Much of the existing academic literature regarding independence is dated to 2014 or 2015. As such, any current predictions need to be made on the basis of current statements by the SNP and Westminster government. Furthermore, much of the news media which reports on these topics have clear biases to one side or the other, alongside lacking substantial qualitative or quantitative depth in how they report on these issues. However, what exists does point to predictions made in this paper. The combination of statements, actions, and existing policy pursued by relevant parties have not had any major changes since 2014 to 2025. The SNP has not made any changes to its independence policies, and any indication that they might has been rejected by the party en masse. The continued stagnancy of this issue and lack of serious change indicate that this is a very mature issue that is unlikely to change or be redirected in the foreseeable future. With these facts in mind, I have several policy proposals that the United States government should pursue. First, there should be a serious investigation into the American public's perceptions of Indyref, which can be used to further inform future policy decisions and investments. There is effectively no literature on how Scotch Americans perceive the issue, nor how the American population as a whole perceives the issue. And understanding how the populace feels about the situation would allow for more informed decisions to be taken. Secondly, once a decision is reached as to which side, if any, is taken, the department should make an announcement of that decision. This is both to influence American opinions on the situation, alongside giving a stronger argument to the chosen side in Scotland. Due to its uncertain position, being given support or disapproval by a foreign nation has proven a substantial impact on the opinions surrounding Indyref. A supportive statement would provide substantial momentum to the independence movement in Scotland, while a negative statement would halt much of its movement in the tracks. Thirdly, the State Department should conduct evaluations on national security considerations around Scotland, with a particular focus on existing nuclear and submarine operations. Due to the SNP's stated aims of wanting to remove foreign military bases and their existing anti-nuclear stances, there should be a consideration to either negotiate terms to maintain deterrence in Scottish waters or new locations for existing bases. The SNP has had some dissent surrounding its policy of nuclear weapons, with the current war in Ukraine, alongside the grandstanding of China and Russia, but the utilization of this dissent could allow for a substantial change in future policy and a continued allowance of nuclear deterrence on Scottish soil. Finally, there should be consideration given to how the North Sea oil fields can be leveraged to the US's needs. US investment in the North Sea is minimal to non-existent, but the impacts of British businesses drilling and selling oil abroad to international oil prices is enough to be of concern. Offering investments by American businesses to drill for oil in Scotland could provide a huge amount of influence over any potentially independent Scotland, alongside further strengthening ties with the United Kingdom in a situation where Indyref fails to materialise. Overall, the Scottish independence movement is something that should be taken note of when considering European strategies, due in large part to Scotland's substantial cultural ties to the American population, its immense oil and natural resource reserves, and existing submarine bases utilised by joint NATO nuclear defence.